A man could ride high one season and be dust in the next. That was the way of the frontier. Nothing lasted long out here. Not land, not cattle, not money, not even family. Under the hard sun of the plains, everything slipped away sooner or later. Folks in Cheyenne Wells once said Elias Turner couldn't be touched. He had good grazing land, fine horses, and a kind of grit that made other men take their hats off when he passed. But the years had a cruel habit of stripping a man bare. By the summer of 1889, Elias was just another body in the dirt. The day was hot enough to make the ground split open and the air quiver. The grass lay dead, yellow and brittle. The water holes had sunk into nothing but mud pits. Even the wind brought no comfort, only grit between a man's teeth. And there, in the middle of all that ruin, Elias Turner lay face down. His back had been carved open, his shirt stiff with blood, the dust clinging to him like a burial shroud. At 51, he still carried the build of a man who had broken wild horses and worked cattle from sunup to sundown. But muscle didn't matter when the world decided to turn its back. Every breath rattled like a barn door in the wind, each one threatening to be his last. Most riders would have spurred their horses faster, not slower. A dying man out on plains was only a reminder of how quickly you could end up the same. But fate has its own twisted humor. The one who found him was Maven Holloway, 33 years old, eyes sharp as flint, a woman whose name never left anyone's lips without a whisper behind it. She'd buried 3 husbands in as many years. Some said sickness, others said bad luck, but the town had already given her a name, the Black Widow. Any other soul in her saddle would have kept riding. That would have been the smart choice. No one in Cheyenne Wells wanted to be tied to a man on death's door, least of all Maven. But something in the shape of that broken body in the dust made her pull on the reins. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was simply that she knew what it felt like to be left behind. She swung down, boots sinking into dry grass, and knelt beside him. His lips cracked, breath wheezing, and he forced out words rough as gravel. "You should run from me." Her stomach dropped. For a second she wanted to climb back on her horse and vanish, leave him to the coyotes. But she didn't. Instead, she dragged him to the shelter of a forgotten cabin on the edge of her land. The place was nothing but warped planks and the stink of mice, but it was better than open sky. She laid him on a cot that sagged like it might snap, then coaxed a trickle of water between his lips. For hours he didn't stir, only breathed like every swallow of air was a fight. When the sun sank and the air cooled, Elias's eyes cracked open, heavy with the look of a man who'd lived through too many hard days. Maven had seen men wake like that before, husbands burning with fever, men who never saw the morning. But something different lived behind Elias's stare. It wasn't just pain. It was weight, memory that pressed like stone. As she wiped blood from his chest, she saw the scars. Not the kind ranch work left. Long, pale cuts across the ribs, a jagged mark near his shoulder. These were made by blades, by bullets. She'd grown up around cowboys. She knew the difference. For a moment she thought about stepping back, reminding herself this wasn't her fight. But her hand kept moving, dipping the cloth, pressing it against the skin. When he finally spoke, his voice rasped. "I wasn't always a rancher." He said the words like a confession, pulled out one splinter at a time. He had killed for his land, done things he couldn't name aloud. Once he had power, men at his side. Then he trusted the wrong ones. They betrayed him, stripped him of everything, and left him branded as a murderer. A chill swept through Maven. She had thought she was nursing a broken rancher. Instead, she had a man with blood on his hands, and enemies still tracking him. Every part of her told her to leave, to let him fend for himself. But when his eyes fluttered shut again and he whispered her name, she stayed. She couldn't explain why. Maybe mercy, maybe defiance, maybe because, for the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. The days dragged on, heavy with cicadas buzzing the grass, and Elias groaning as his body clawed its way back from death. He grew stronger, able to sit, to swallow water without choking. Maven began to believe he might actually survive. Then one afternoon, quiet cracked apart. A rider came up the dirt path, dust boiling behind like smoke. Maven's got twisted before she even made out the face. Caleb Doyle. She knew him too well. The younger brother of her third husband. A man who drank hard and swung harder. The town called him reckless. She called him dangerous. He swung down from his horse with a swagger that made her skin crawl. His eyes ran over her, and that grin spread, the kind that stripped a woman bare without a single touch. He spat into the dirt and said he'd heard she had a stranger tucked away. Said maybe she wasn't done digging graves for men yet. Heat rose in Maven's face, shame tangled with fury. She told him to leave. Caleb just stepped closer, muttering filth under his breath, reaching for her arm like she was nothing but livestock. The rope was nearly around her when Elias filled the doorway. His steps were uneven, his body not fully mended, but the sight of Caleb with a fire in him that pain could not smother. His voice came out low, steady, the kind that cut through air like steel and made even the boldest man hesitate. Caleb only laughed, calling him a dying rancher, sneering that Maven had always had a weakness for failures. But Elias didn't flinch. He walked out into the yard, each movement slow, deliberate, like a man retracing steps he'd taken long before. The two men faced each other in the dirt. Caleb thought the half-broken rancher would crumble. But when Elias's fist snapped across his jaw, the sound cracked like a gunshot. Caleb staggered, stunned that the man still had that kind of strength. He spat curses, scrambled onto his horse, and fled, swearing vengeance. Maven stood motionless, shaken in a way she hadn't felt in years. For once, someone had put themselves between her and cruelty. For once, she wasn't fighting her battles alone. But Caleb carried that punch like a wound, and men like him never let wounds heal. A week later, Maven heard the rhythm of hooves beating across the yard. She lifted her head from the wash tub, and the sight drained the blood from her face. Caleb had returned, and riding beside him was Jonas Doyle, his older brother. Folks spoke of Jonas in hushed tones. If Caleb was fire, Jonas was ice. At 32, he carried himself with a cold precision that measured land, lives, and blood in equal weight. And he had never forgiven Maven for the disgrace her marriage had brought upon their name. The brothers reined in before the cabin, dust swirling around their boots. Caleb's jaw still bore the dark bruise of Elias's fist, but his grin was wide and venomous. Jonas said little, yet the way his eyes moved from Maven to Elias made it clear he hadn't come for talk. Elias stepped outside, straighter now than before, though the scars of his wounds still tugged at him. His hand hovered near his belt, though he wore no gun. Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn rope, until Jonas broke it with words heavy as a verdict. You and this woman conspired to kill my brother. The accusation cut the air. Maven's breath caught. Caleb fanned the flames, shouting that the town already believed it. And perhaps they did. Out here, rumor had a way of hardening into truth. Elias gave no answer, but a stare sharp enough to dare them forward. Caleb, hot-blooded, reached for his gun. The yard erupted. Dust swirled. Fists flew, boots struck, and the crack of knuckles sounded like pistol fire. Maven cried out, clawing to pull them apart, but there was no halting it. Then Caleb, blinded by rage, shouted too loud. He screamed that the whole scheme had never been Maven's doing, that it had always been their family's design. The words spilled raw and unguarded, and a farmhand by the fence heard every syllable. Truth sometimes escapes when pride drives a man past his senses. The fight ended with Jonas dragging his brother to the horses. Caleb spat oaths of return, and together they rode off, leaving dust and venom behind. Elias stood panting, Maven beside him, both knowing the matter was far from done. The Doyle brothers would be back. But Caleb's outburst could not be swallowed. The farmhand carried to others and whispers spread. Not all believed, but doubt began to crack the wall of lies that had bound Maven for years. Elias knew peace was fragile in the West. There was always another fight, another grudge, another man ready to draw blood. Yet when he looked at Maven, he saw not the cursed woman others named her, but someone who had survived storms and still had the will to kneel beside a stranger in his worst hour. A woman scarred, yet unbroken. Maven had long since abandoned the hope of kindness. She had learned to live under the weight of suspicion. But when Elias mended the broken corral, When he patched the roof board by board, something long buried stirred. She planted wildflowers where the ground had gone bare, and slowly the place began to breathe again. They didn't speak of love in the way of a young. Their bond was quieter, forged in evenings when the wind softened and lantern light flickered, in mornings when the coffee boiled and no eyes watched them. Theirs was not a love to be shouted or celebrated. It was two weary souls deciding, day after day, not to turn away. In the West, a man could lose everything, his land, his family, his good name. But if he still had the courage to stand beside someone when the world cast him aside, then maybe he had not lost it all. So ask yourself, if you were Maven, would you have reigned in that day, or kept riding and left Elias Turner in the dust? And if you were Elias, would you have stood for her when Caleb returned to tear her down? If this tale has struck a chord, stay with it. There are more stories waiting, more dust, more reckonings on the horizon. Out here, every choice writes another chapter.